A lot of these things are connected in ways that you don't really expect. I don't think anything that you learn is really in any kind of vacuum. My dad was educated as a physicist, raised us to like really think for ourselves, especially when it came to faith, right? He would basically tell us like, my faith is not your faith. Like you have to read the Bible and make these decisions for yourself. And then even then in high school, we'd do like speech and debate, and we would do a certain like number of types of events for like 2 years. And then our mom would be like, yeah, it seems like the learning's kind of plateaued. Let's go do something else. Just that mindset of basically, I'm good enough at this thing now that my time is better spent doing something I know less about.
Hello, and welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And this week we have on another Unbound alumni, and in this case, it's somebody who, in some ways, I consider to be my predecessor, and now he has moved on to do some really cool stuff.
Well, not just predecessor, David, you may not know this, but part of the reason that you work for Unbound is that Ben, on his way out of Unbound, said, have you talked to David Rethemeyer? He'd be great for you guys. And I was like, we should do that. So there's definitely a connection point there. Yeah, you came with the Ben Billups endorsement originally. And of course, we knew who David was, but Ben prompted us, you should talk to him sooner rather than later. And we did, and it's been great for us. You can ask David separately what he thinks of that whole arrangement. But yeah, we were excited to bring Ben back. As you can see, as we start this interview, there's some pretty interesting connections that he has, not just with Unbound, but with the Be Unbound podcast. I don't know how to intro this. Ben Billups, I think it's appropriate to say welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast, but you are the real OG, as you were the first host of the Be Unbound podcast. And actually, we have far more episodes where you would probably have been saying that to me than the other way around. So be that as it may, we're absolutely delighted to have you back here today. So thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm here this week with Jonathan Brush and David Rethemeyer. And today we're going to talk about me, which is the subject that I like the most. So I hope you guys enjoy this podcast. How's that?
Jonathan, I was feeling really secure in my job security up until about 15 seconds ago.
Well, I was actually getting really excited because I thought he was going to talk about me. And instead, then he switched it back to him. And so now, because I was like, oh, this podcast is going to be more fun than I expected. And then here we are. And of course, before we started, we said we were going to talk about David, and we're not doing that either. So I guess we'll have to talk about Ben. And honestly, I think he's earned it. So Ben has had, I don't know, Ben, are you on your 10th career now, 11th? I'm not sure how many it is, but it's been a fair run in a couple of different areas, although with some common threads. So at this point, we're famous because Ben went through Unbound. It's not the other way around, so we're really pretty tickled about that, and has done multiple different things, including is responsible for the birth of this round of Unbound. And it is, we don't want him to get too stuck up, but it is probably safe to say that we would not be still here alive and kicking if it wasn't for Ben back a couple of years giving us a good launch. And now is the founder, CEO, president, and all the big names of Noble. And so, Ben, tell us a little bit about what you've been doing since you gave up your dream gig of hosting the Be Unbound podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's pretty much been downhill since then, but I've been kind of picking up the bits and pieces and making the most of it.
The life back together. We understand.
Yeah. So. Yeah, exactly. It can't all be up at the end of the day.
You have to go through tragedy in order to be able to appreciate the good times, right?
Exactly. I'm hoping to recover and come back at someday as the host. But yeah, so with Noble, it's been a pretty natural evolution. It basically just started with, I was working on an e-commerce brand as an in-house guy. And then, strangely enough, had like a weird stint where I was also the digital director for a gubernatorial campaign. And then basically after that campaign wrapped up, I started getting, and like half of this stuff isn't even on my LinkedIn. So, you guys are getting the special, the extra info. But
as only as appropriate. Yeah. So
yes.
By the way, I ran a gubernatorial campaign. You know what I mean? Like that's the stuff that's not on my LinkedIn campaign. He slept that in that, tried to do that casually, but it's worth pointing out. All right, continue, Ben.
Yeah. But basically, like after that wrapped up, I had a lot of success with the brand I was working with. And then so between my like weird connections in the political world and a bunch of random connections in the business world, just started getting lots of referrals. So I just started freelancing on the side. So it's like I had a regular full-time job, and then I just started handling a few clients here and there on the side. And we got some big referrals to start. So one of them was, a little bit politically oriented, more like a publisher brand. And then another major publisher that we've worked with for the last 2+ years is the New York Sun. And then, having those like kind of bigger clients to start with just as referrals, we started to build a portfolio of case studies and basically just kept taking one step forward. So then eventually at the end of, I think it would have been the end of 2022, it finally made sense where, it was pretty obvious that my full-time gig and my freelancing were in conflict, and it made sense to focus on the freelancing. So I left my full-time gig, I think it was November maybe of 22, and then just started taking on more clients. Then I would personally hit capacity around like 6 to 8 clients. So then I started just bringing in support. So, a lot of like part-time support for copywriting. And then actually one of the first people I hired was Jace Bauer, who's also a big part of the Unbound community, originally just to do copywriting, like direct response copywriting for the New York Sun. And then eventually brought him in pretty close to full-time as an account manager, handling a bunch of different stuff. And we just kept growing purely through referral. So in 2023, we basically tripled on referral. But up to that point, it was basically just me, Jace, and like maybe 1 or 2 freelancers. And then back in December, we launched a new offer that just completely exploded. And so since then, we've grown another 300% between January and May. And our team, if you include part-timers, our team is up to about 9 or 10 now. So it's becoming like, it's just over time, like it's just become kind of like, oh, this is like a real company now. Whereas like it used to just be sort of like been freelancing with some help. So happy to get into the details there, but that's just been kind of the progression over the last few years.
Well, I really appreciate that setup, and I appreciate that kind of description of what you're doing. Because now, Ben, this is going to be incomplete, and we joked about your gubernatorial campaign, but I've known you for more than 10 years, probably coming on 15, close to it, something like that, 14, 15 years, something like that.
I think, wasn't I on the cabinet in like 2013 or something like that?
Yeah, but you would, yeah. So I guess. And
then before, there was something
a little more
like
than 10
that.
years. Yeah. So there's been a long association here. And so as I kind of look back, I hear some of the highlights that I remember, and you can kind of like, if you miss something. So I know Ben as a filmmaker and an extraordinarily talented filmmaker, somebody who obviously has hosted podcasts and has experience in those kinds of areas, a writer, somebody who's done a lot of work in marketing, somebody who's done a lot of work in politics, somebody's done a lot of work in journalism. And sometimes those things mix and sometimes they didn't. Pretty decent skateboarder from what I understand, although I haven't had quite as much firsthand experience of that as some of the things, but somebody's interested in that is maybe a better way to say it. Very into jujitsu. And then that's just, and somebody that I've had just extraordinarily wide-ranging conversations with, covering a variety of subjects, most of which Ben is way more educated than your average person. And now business owner, founder and business owner. And so if I have any golden threads to pull through that, Ben, since I've known you, you've been a voracious, almost ferocious learner. And in fact, one of my favorite memories is, and this would have been back a little while, not too long ago, but you informed me that brain plasticity sort of sat up at like 25 or something like that. So you had this like extremely intense learning process that you were going through before you hit 25 to kind of like pack it all in. And I just got the hugest kick out of that. So there's just a wide range of stuff there. And then somebody who is very articulate in matters of faith and theology and philosophy and all those kinds of things. So anyhow, I'm curious, like what caused that ferocious kind of, and I mean this in a good way, aggressive learning that has characterized you as long as I've known you? What was kind of the genesis of that?
It's hard for me to say, really. I remember that even as a kid. Like, as a kid, I was always just very curious, and I would annoy people with the sheer number of questions I would ask them about different things. And I think I've always viewed things more as a continuum than in terms of events. Like, I would, even back when we were just like making random films for like the whatever it was, 3 versions of Unbound ago, we would even be making ads like while we were in the program. And we would pitch gigs, and then we would shoot random videos, and we would just do the best that we could. And then if things didn't pan out or like whatever happened, like I've always, for a long time, as long as I can remember, I've just looked at things as like, well, like that's just more information that we'll have next time we do something like this. The thing that's maybe been like the most unexpected over time is just like how much the different disciplines inform each other. So like even if you roll the clock way back, like as a kid, I would play a lot of music. Like I played lots of guitar, a little bit of piano, stuff like that. And I even think that what I learned about like timing and like whatever rhythm and like structure even informed like how I edited videos. And then like making marketing videos, you learn about storytelling. And then once you understand storytelling, it's actually really easy to get into copywriting. And then once you're in copywriting, it's actually really easy to like start turning that into like messaging strategies for brands that like, and it turns out there's some brands that will pay a lot of money for that kind of stuff, right? And so like a lot of these things are connected in ways that you don't really expect. Like none of these, I don't think anything that you learn is really in any kind of vacuum. And so you know, there's going to be like the Venn diagrams are going to cross over more or less with different things, but it's incredibly hard to define what those things are. I think like, and honestly, like a big part of it was just things that were even distilled in me by my parents. Like my dad he was educated as a physicist, like raised us to like really think for ourselves, especially when it came to faith, right? Like I remember being like 11 or 12 years old, and he would basically tell us like, my faith is not your faith. Like you have to read the Bible and make these decisions for yourself. And that was like a big part of that. And then even then, like back, like we would, in high school, we'd do like speech and debate, and we would do like, yeah, it depends on how much you know about speech and debate, but we would do a certain like number of types of events for like 2 years. And then our mom would be like, yeah, it seems like the learning's kind of plateaued. Let's go do something else. And I think that just that mindset of like, okay, like I'm good enough at this thing now that my time is better spent doing something I know less about, I think has been like I think that's just really instilled that mindset, where that even has impacted my professional career, where a lot of times at like different jobs or working on client projects these days, obviously, like we're incentivized as a business to retain clients for as long as possible. So we're not just like, oh, this isn't interesting anymore, like we're not working with you. But what I do instead is if I say, okay, I've got this figured out, like I'm not really interested in it, then I just delegate it, right? I figure out how to like plug someone else into the account and keep it going. And then I go focus on another client where there is something interesting there. And that's not always a good idea from a business perspective, because sometimes it just means you're doing lots of random custom things, which is not always the right way to build a business. But I think that mindset led to us developing products and services that are pretty unique and have product market fit. And in a lot of ways, it's basically that mindset now is being applied to kind of like product development, you could say, and like having product market fit or having client service fit, whatever you want to call it. And that's incredibly valuable to the business. But of course, that can apply to like lots of areas of life.
I think that you said something, lots of interesting things there, but that transition point, and I was really intrigued when you said your mom said, okay, I think we've learned enough here. Our learning plateaus and move to the next thing. I've watched you do that in different places in different areas, right? So there's it's clicking along, and then all of a sudden Ben's like, all right, it's next, and go there. Is that a instinct? Is there a calculus there? Because I think that ability to switch and to change and to move to something else, that's a heavy characteristic of the ability to learn new things, right? It also gave you the opportunity to, you went through that whole thing, copywriting led to this, and like being able to play music led to editing and all those things. Sure, but you have to make some jumps to be able to find the connections, right? And I think that part, there's lots of things that you said there that's unique, but one of the things that maybe sort of stands out as the most unique is that ability to make that switch. How do you determine that? Can you describe it? Do you have any kind of calculus for it, or is it more of an instinct?
I mean, I think ultimately, like, it is like a pretty intuitive thing, and I'm a pretty intuitive guy. So like, it's not like I have a spreadsheet of like, I'm 89% proficient in this skill. Although for somebody else,
I just want you to know that would not have surprised me if you'd said that. I don't know, I guess that you'd say that, but if you had, I'd been like, yeah, that makes sense. So.
But I think really, I guess really probably the surest sign of like a learning plateau is if something becomes kind of boring and repetitive. That's probably the exact moment you're good at it, and the exact moment that also you're not learning as much as you were before. So if something is new and challenging and you're not even sure if you can do it, that's growth mode. If something is like, all right, like it's Tuesday, I got to do this again. Sometimes you just got to do that stuff, right? Like there's lots of boring things that we all have to do all the time that just need to be done. But from a learning perspective, like if you're just looking at it in terms of like pure learning plateaus, I think that's typically the moment where you can say like, all right, like this is something I could either stop doing, or it's something I could delegate, or it's something that maybe you'll keep doing, but you figure out how to reduce the amount of time you're spending on it so you can spend more time doing things that basically you don't know how to do.
Well, you said something about boredom there, but that's an interesting kind of reaction, because I think most people, when they get to the point they know how to do things, they don't consider that to be boredom. They consider it to be comfort. I mean, there's a comfort level there. But I'm chuckling at that because I remember many years ago, and you went kind of through a physical fitness transformation. And so I remember I was in the conversation, but I listened to you, and somebody said, "What did you do for training?" And you're like, "I don't know. I just did something till it hurt and figured that probably helped." And so, but I thought that was, I don't know how wise that is in terms of the best way to get
Not
fit.
very.
But I thought that was interesting that there was a deliberate seeking out of the discomfort. I don't know that you were you were kind of seeking out pain, but you were seeking out the discomfort. So there's an element of that, right? So when most people would say, "Okay, I'm comfortable now, I know what I'm doing," you've translated that into it's time to get uncomfortable. I mean, I don't know if that's boredom or whatever, but it seems to me that you have a sort of continual drive to put yourself in places that you don't know what you're doing, which, I think at this point in time, you're going to find less and less frequent just in terms of the breadth of your experience. But what is that the correct assessment of how you got there? And what kind of caused you to build that sort of trigger?
I don't know. I think there's a way to, like, there's definitely like a pain tolerance involved in anything new that you're doing. I also think that pain tolerance is something that you can build over time. And I think there's also a way to trick your brain into almost turning that to like a reward mechanism, right? And I think, and sometimes that's just as simple as like reminding yourself that if something seems new or overwhelming or difficult, like even right now in the business, there's like lots of things going on where I'm like, I have no idea how to do any of these things. And it's pretty overwhelming sometimes, but you also just, I think sometimes it's just as simple as like either I look at it as, well, the people who have accomplished the things that I want to accomplish have gone through this. So in a lot of ways, you can look at it as kind of like a rite of passage to like reach a level of performance in whatever field you're talking about. And then the other way to look at it is just that the person that I want to be is somebody who's capable of doing this. And so like, I think a lot of I guess you could say like pain tolerance is sometimes just about like grounding yourself in a future state where you say, okay, well, like, okay, let's say just for example, like I can't do 100 pull-ups. You're like, okay, but do you want to be the type of person who wants to do 100 pull-ups? And it's like, yeah, if the answer is yes, it's like, well, then do 10 and then do 20 and then do 50. And then eventually you could do 100. And like, you have to build up that strength and tolerance. And I think that's true in almost everything.
Well, I think there's an aspect of that where you said it's deliberate, right? I mean, there's a question in there that I think is interesting. So talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's interesting. Do I want to be the kind of person that wants to do 100 pull-ups? You said that fairly matter-of-factly. My sense is that's a fairly unusual question that people ask.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm not sure how to elaborate on that, but I think that is the question to ask. Because like even now, sometimes I think about like, how big should the business be? And how big does it need to be? And what, like, from a lifestyle perspective, like it definitely dominates by time. And at this rate of growth makes sense. Like there kind of isn't really a way around that at the moment. But then also it's also very tangible reality for me that this can't go on forever, right? I can't do 70, 80-hour weeks for like 10 years, but I can do it for 2 if I'm working to get to a position where I can either work less or like have more leverage or be able to spend my time in ways that I think are superior. So I think in a sense, and again, like this is just because like in a lot of ways, my current obsession is basically like business. But I think for anyone that could be anything in particular, right? Like if you want to become like a top 5, like world violinist, you probably have to practice until your fingers bleed, probably, right? Like you just have to think like, what did the person that I want to be have to go through to get there? And then you have to say, okay, am I willing to do what it takes to get there? And if the answer is yes, then do it. And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you've set the wrong goal, right? Maybe you don't want to be a top 5. Maybe you want to be a top 50, and that's fine. Playing a couple of local orchestras and like, be great, like, big fish in a small pond, however you want to look at it. But I think a lot of it just comes down to, I think a lot of goals are set without either A, realizing what it takes to do it, or B, you get halfway there and then you realize you don't even want to be the type of person that you have to be in order to accomplish that. And if that's the case, then yeah, probably should change the goal. But that's part of the whole learning process too. Sometimes you have to get halfway there and then you say, you know what, like whatever it is, like I probably couldn't become a billionaire without being like this insanely like ruthless person. And maybe I don't want to be that person, so I shouldn't aim to be a billionaire, right? But also I want to make the most of the opportunities I have and I want to learn a lot. And so we're just building this business organically. But I don't have these like arbitrary number goals of like 10 million or a billion. I don't really work with that. I work with what's in front of me and I figure out like, okay, so like, should we grow it? Should we keep it? Should we sustain it? Is it sustainable? Should I do something else entirely? Like those are the questions that I ask, but I think the reason why they don't get asked very often is because those are also the questions that are like most disruptive to your psyche. They basically impact the way that you think about yourself the most. But that's also exactly why they're the questions that you should probably ask the most.
Well, I think there's a really interesting connection with the way that you're explaining how to go about looking to set goals, in that I think most people, when they think about goal setting, they think about just the tangible result. I want to be able to buy a house. I want to start a business, whatever that you might be trying to accomplish. But the piece that you're putting in there is that you want to be the type of person who gets to that goal. And so it's not just reaching the tangible goal, it's who you as an individual have to become in order to achieve that goal. And so I'm really curious to just kind of hear how you make that connection between who kind of the identity piece of working towards goals in addition to the actual result, because I don't think that's something that I hear very often.
I think it's something that's really important to consider. I don't know. It's not like, I don't think there's a clear-cut answer for anyone. It's like Jace recently left to become a pastor in Virginia, and I'm stoked for him. But it's like, that's a big swing for him, where it's like, he doesn't want to be a businessman. He wants to be a pastor, and being a pastor has its own set of difficulties and requirements. And like, I think Jace has what it takes to be like a top 10 pastor, period. Right. I think the other part of the identity equation is also like the advice that you take. So it's like, and this is just like pure math, which is, let's say you want to be a top 10% engineer at Google or something like that, right? That means that you literally have to ignore 90% of the advice that you get, which sounds crazy, but it's true. But then like a big part of that equation as well is like, it's very hard to know like what's the top 10% advice and what's the 90% that you should ignore. That's very ambiguous. But in terms of like broad concept math, like that is the math.
The goals you outlined are not small goals, but in some sense are micro goals. You said, so I can build the business 70 hours a week for the next 2 years. 2 years is in some ways a micro goal, in the grand scheme of things. I'm curious, do you, as you think about who you want to become, do you ever think about that on a macro sense? Do you have a sort of an ideal of some kind of, I want to reach this? You've said, I don't know that I want to become a billionaire, but, is there some sort of bigger multi-year campaign type goal that you have or not?
I think like broad strokes, yes. The details I'm like very open-handed with, because I've been wrong about the details on pretty much every occasion.
I can relate to that.
Yeah. So, but I think like there's actually a really interesting book that I highly recommend, even if you're not interested in business. It's called Built to Sell. And like one of the concepts in the book is that, let's say, for example, you want to build a business in order to sell it. In order to sell a business, you have to own a business that somebody could buy. And when they buy it, they don't want to buy a job. They want to buy an asset that cash flows. That's what they want. So in order to sell a business, you have to create an asset that can operate completely independently of you. And so that's where I think, like, just as an example, like a lot of freelancers make the mistake of basically leaving their job and buying themselves another job where they're just their own manager. And now they work like 80 hours a week and they have no work-life balance, but they also don't even have a thing they could sell because the business is so dependent on them. You can't sell that to someone, because if you're doing graphic design for 80 hours a week or whatever it is, wedding photography, and you sell that to someone, it's like, well, now they have to do that for 80 hours a week. It's like, that's not a business model. That isn't an asset. That's just like a high-powered freelancer type operation. So the thought process for me is, we're definitely on to something in terms of like having product market fit with a service. We have to do a lot of work right now, but the work that I would say I'm spending around 70 or 80% of my time doing things purely to set up the business in such a way that it can operate without me at some point. And so that the first step there is getting yourself out of basically business operations and fulfillment. So those are the first things that we recruited. The next thing is getting myself out of sales, because I'm still doing all the sales. So that's like a 6 to 12 month window realistically for me to really like systematize, formalize a sales process and be able to delegate that to someone. And then so the thought process here is that in about 2 years, in an ideal situation, I would either have a business I own that doesn't need me, that's just an asset that cash flows, and you have to get to the same position in order to sell it if you ever wanted to sell it. And people ask me that all the time, which is like, or are you trying to sell a business? And I'm like, I don't even have to decide yet, because I have to do the same things either way. If I want to own it or if I want to sell it, I have to do the same things. So all I know for sure is I have to follow this path for, probably at least another 2 years in order to get to the position that I want to be in. And then in terms of like really big picture, like more like life goals and whatnot, I was very fortunate to have an upbringing where my dad, he worked in Silicon Valley, he was remote. I spent a lot of time with my parents and I was homeschooled. And there's a lot of aspects of my childhood that I would love to recreate for my children. And especially like, whatever, you take into account like inflation and like all these different things happening in the world. The way that I look at it is, if I want to be able to spend a disproportionate amount of time with my kids, especially, in the more like formative years, then I need to set myself up in such a way that I have the option to. And so like, even if you just think about it in terms of like, yeah, I'd love to have a family someday, and I would love to even work like 10 or 20 hours a week if I wanted to. And then I have to create the environment where I can do that. So like, I guess I hope that answers your question, but that's like, in terms of big picture thinking, like, I'd love to like engage more in charitable causes. I'd love to engage more at church. I'd love to have a good family life. But a lot of ways, like I think about business the same way that Napoleon thought about war, which is anytime Napoleon was creating a war strategy, he would always go down the path that generated the most options for him, because the more options you have, the harder it is for you to lose. And so if I look at business the same way, it's like, okay, we're going to go down these paths. If there's one path I can go down that generates 2 options and another path that I can go down that generates 12, I'm going to go down the one that generates 12, even if it's harder and it takes more time. And so that thought process just means that no matter what's happening, right? Because like, I don't know when I'm going to get married or have kids or anything, but if I put myself in the position where I can actually build the lifestyle that I think is going to be most beneficial to my family when I get to that point, then I'll be thanking myself for working as hard as I am right now. So there's a lot of ways to think about it, but this is just how I think about it. And I don't think this mindset is the right mindset for everyone. It's just my perspective.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm asking for, your perspective. I think that's, if I kind of reflect that back a little bit, it's on a macro sense, you're opening up a situation that gives you as many options as possible. You have some ideas of what the options are that you'd like to take, but also that might involve selling the business. It might involve keeping the business. It might involve travel. It might involve not traveling, and it might involve shifting to work for something else, all of which might come out as opportunities. I find it's interesting when I think of macro goals, when I was younger, I had a lot of macro goals. As I've gotten older, they've shifted to more micro goals. There's been more pressing things, but I've always been intrigued. Like, I've got some macro goals that sort of are over here, and then there's other ones, and they're easier to measure in terms of material things. Like, okay, well, I want to do this to the house, or I want to do this vehicle-wise, right? Those kinds of things. And that's easy because it's easy to kind of put a thing around it. But yet, instinctively, that's not what really motivates me the most. And so it's been a little interesting to try to think about, okay, how do I put to any kind of measurable system the things that I really care about the most? And those are things like, I want to be part of a really rich community. I really want to contribute to making a difference to things that I think are problems. And that's a lot harder to quantify. Hey, the couple minutes we have left, Ben, and we won't be able to fully delve into this, but we were talking a little bit before we recorded. I always want to contextualize this. Every generation has their problems, and I think that they also have their blessings and strengths and abilities. So, my experience working with now millennials and Gen Z has been overwhelmingly, tremendously over-the-top positive. So I am not a person that complains about generational problems of certain kinds. My experience with people from any generation, but particularly from the younger generations, has been extraordinary. But there are some characteristics that I see. And one of the things that I see that pops up maybe more frequently in the last 2 or 3 years is a level of a bit of fragility, and that comes with a lack of hope. I asked this of you, and I should start asking it of just more people across the podcast in general. But it's intriguing in your sense because 2 things. You're about the most anti-fragile person I know, which is meant as a sincere compliment. But you also have been somebody who, I don't know that you don't exhibit this by going around dancing and sprinkling sunshine rainbows around, but you also tend to be a very hopeful person. You've always contextualized everything you're doing in a sense of deep-seated optimism that's connected to something bigger. Talk a little bit about that, because I think that what is it that you think is giving you some of those anti-fragile roots?
Well, one is reading the book Antifragile.
And you were probably the first person I know who talked about that. For longtime listeners, Trent Emick is a really big fan of that book as well. But yes, I think you were the first person that told me about antifragile.
That's Nicholas Nassim Taleb. Yeah.
Yes, I was like, there's an N and there's a T and there's a very, yeah, right, got it. So
yeah, if you ever want to get your brain bended into a pretzel, you can read some of his other books too, like Fooled by Randomness and Black Swan. Like, I try to listen to those on audiobook, and I'm just like, I have no idea what this guy's talking about anymore. But every once in a while, he brings up deadlifts. I'm like, okay, I'm here. But he'll just talk about like probabilistic theories for like stock trading, and you're just like, what is going on? And then he's like, here's the application for life, and you're like, what? But yeah, Antifragile is a great book, and a lot of this, like, there's also a great TED talk from Tim Ferriss. It's called Fear Setting. So instead of goal setting, he talks about fear setting, which is essentially identifying the worst case scenario that could happen with like an opportunity, for example. And then if you can figure out how to deal with that worst case scenario, then you're good. Like, you have nothing to worry about. And I think that plus kind of like, and that's very similar to anti-fragile thinking. One of the core concepts in the book that he talks about anti-fragile is that like 99.9% of decisions you make are non-fatal, right? And that's just not, it's not non-fatal even technically in the literal sense, but also like non-fatal in terms of like relationships or like lifestyle, or exactly,
catastrophic consequences, right?
Right. And so like there's risk we're taking in the business right now, and like every once in a while I have to remind myself, I was like, this entire thing could implode and I could just go get a job. Like, that's
right.
And that's honestly not a bad outcome. I could just go get some job and work at some place and be fine, and I could probably get a job pretty quickly. And so it's just like, and so anytime it seems like, oh, things are like scary and risky with the business, I'm like, yeah, that's fine. I don't mind. I mean, it's a little bit broader now that we're kind of responsible for like other people's income as well. You get the picture gets a little bit bigger. But on like a personal level, I'm like, I can deal with a lot of like bad scenarios. So I think that's a big component of it. And I think also, especially for anyone who's a Christian, your worst case scenario is like literally living in a gutter and you know you're going to heaven when you die. Like, that's like your baseline is pretty low, because no matter where you are or how much money you're making or who you know or what's going on in life, like, you're a blessed child of God who's going to heaven and you'll see God when you die. Like, that's it doesn't get any better than that. And so I think in like broader, especially like kind of like North American culture, there's definitely like a lot of issues, you know, that are popping up with like drug abuse and suicide rates, like all these things that are happening in the world. And I think for a lot of people, that's a byproduct of not having a hope that's more central than like, oh, I hope I get into the school I want to go to, or I get the job that I want, et cetera, or I have the type of status in society that I would like to have. You know, there's millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people out there where that's like, if they don't get that, they don't know what to do. And I think the difference for us is that if we don't get that, we're still an incredibly blessed child of God with the greatest gift we could ever possibly have. And for me, that grounds a lot of things. And that also makes me like take more risks and be more optimistic, because my downside is so much lower, if that makes sense, like in proportion to what I already have and what I can't lose.
Yeah, we have a fantastic board, and one of our board members, we had what I considered to be a catastrophic failure. He had a different opinion, and we were having a rough time. And he called me and he says, okay, first, just take a deep breath. And he says, second, as a believer, this is as bad as it gets. And he said, and if you're not a believer, this is as good as it gets. And so he's like, for the first of all, just get some new perspective. And now that you've got that perspective, he said, you know, go outside, hug your kids, kiss your wife, and we'll deal with this tomorrow. And the application, I think, has been big for me in lots of different ways. In other words, first of all, no matter how bad it is, get some perspective. Eternally, this is probably not a big deal. Probably in the course of your community, this isn't a big deal. The people closest to you, you know. I was at a point, I live in a rural community, and there are really almost nobody in my church that has the foggiest idea what I do or really understands it. It's just kind of the reality. I'm not teaching in the local school system, and I am not running a tractor for a living. And so we've now expired most of the ideas of how people earn a living. And I, at one point, Kara said, you realize everything could fail and nobody at church would even notice. Right. and the sense that, you know, they just, that's not who they know you. That's not your identity. And there's something greatly comforting in that, and having a community that does not derive your value from what your occupation is. Ben, I'm looking at the clock and thinking, man, I've got like 8 questions and probably 3 more hours, but we're not as cool as Joe Rogan yet. And so we'll probably have to split this into multiple episodes and do it again. But I'm really grateful for you come back, sharing the wisdom that you've gained recently and over a long time. It was there before as well, but it's been honed recently, and giving perspectives. Every time I listen to you, you've challenged, in a good way, challenged my thinking, had made get some different perspectives, and it's been an encouragement. Talking to Ben never disappoints. Equal parts, some fun, some humor, some going back and forth, picking on each other. And then what I think characterizes Ben more than anything else, some significant insights and perspectives that I never think about. And after listening to Ben, I'm like, oh, that's a really good point. I'm glad I thought of that. Glad I heard that. Not that I thought of it. Glad that he thought of that so I could learn from it. So.
Yeah. He has just a really neat set of perspectives. And he was talking to us a little bit after we finished recording about how he sometimes thinks like, my perspective, I know a lot of people will tend to find it kind of cold and austere. And I can see where he's coming from, but also there's just the fact that he still has such an attitude of hope, like we talked about there towards the end, and the fact that he says things with such an amount of confidence and knowledge that he has behind it that even, like, especially when he talks about things like hope, it's just like, yeah, that actually makes a lot of practical sense. This is not just a optimism that's playing off of your emotions. This is very practically based, and I think that's something that we don't hear a whole lot of, and so I really appreciate that about Ben.
Ben is not personality-wise a cold and austere person, but he does have a logical mind that asks questions against the heart of a matter in a way that doesn't go through all the fancy stuff, right? And so like a lot of people will get sidetracked on the emotional banter on the way there and sort of miss the point. And one of Ben's huge assets is he never misses a point. He generally has the ability to go straight to it. And that becomes a really interesting asset, both in business and things like that. But also having him as a friend, because he tends to have a really good ability to put his finger on the problem and say, I think it's there. And then and people are often uncomfortable because like, it is. I just didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to admit it. And that's a pretty cool superpower. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Ben. At the end, we were inviting Ben to come to Apex as an alum. And so we're trying to encourage all of our alumni to come back. So if you are an alumni of Unbound and you're listening to that, just remember that you're welcome at all of our events, in particular at Apex. But this year is a particularly exciting Apex, as we have a big reunion year coming on this time. We have some really kind of milestones that we've hit, and we would be delighted to have you come back. So if you're not already planning to come with your family to Apex, just understand that that is an open invitation. You can go to beunbound.us/Apex and get all the information there. And there's a real good chance that there's a bunch of your friends who are already signed up, as we're looking at a large alumni crowd and their families come back to Apex this year. Also, if you want to join the family, so to speak, and be part of the alumni base in the future, then the way to come to Apex is to check out beunbound.us and learn about our Ascend program, be a part of that. And then finally, if you're intrigued by that, but you're not really sure if you want to take the full plunge, go to beunbound.us or give us a call, because we're about to release a program that allows some folks to attend Apex, even if you're not doing the full program, as a way to kind of test it out and put your toe in the waters. And so we're looking forward to Apex, which is coming up pretty soon here. By the time this airs, it'll be right around the corner. And if you're interested in all those things, don't forget to go to beunbound.us. Until then, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. And until we meet again, be unbound.